The cabin stood silent in the January cold, its logs dark with an oil treatment that smelled faintly of salmon even 3 months after application, while inside Lars Peterson sat comfortably beside a fire half the size his neighbors required to survive the same brutal night. What the Norwegian fisherman had discovered during his first deadly winter in Montana Territory would save dozens of lives over the next 2 decades and change how frontier settlers built in the coldest regions of the American West. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more unbelievable survival technique from the 1800s. The fire in the center of the cabin had been burning for 6 hours straight, consuming split pine at a rate that would exhaust their woodpile in less than 2 weeks. Lars Peterson fed another log into the flames and watched sparks rise toward the crude smoke hole in the roof. The temperature inside the cabin hovered somewhere around 40 degrees. Outside, it was 20 below zero. His partner, Henrik Strand, sat wrapped in both their blankets, still shivering. The year was 1867. Montana Territory had been officially established only 3 years earlier, and the land around what would become Missoula was still largely wilderness. Lars and Henrik had arrived in September following rumors of good trapping along the tributaries of the Clark Fork River. They were both Norwegian immigrants who had worked fishing boats in the Atlantic before coming west. They understood cold weather. They understood hard work. What they did not understand yet was that coastal cold and mountain cold were entirely different animals. Their cabin had taken 5 days to build in late September when the weather was still mild. They had followed the construction methods they observed in other frontier structures. Cut lodgepole pines, notch the ends, stack them to form walls roughly 12 feet by 14 feet. Fill the gaps between logs with moss and mud. Build a simple door from split planks. Leave a smoke hole in the roof and construct a basic fire pit in the center of the dirt floor. The entire structure was functional and seemed adequate when autumn temperatures were in the 40s and 50s. November had revealed the cabin's inadequacy. December had made it dangerous. Now, in the second week of January, the cabin was becoming a death trap, despite their constant efforts to keep the fire burning. Lars could feel cold air moving across the floor. The moss and mud chinking between the logs had dried and cracked, creating gaps that wind passed through freely. The notched corners where logs joined showed even larger gaps as the wood contracted in the extreme cold. The door, constructed from unseasoned planks, had warped and no longer fit its frame properly. Cold air poured in around all 4 edges. The smoke hole that vented their fire also vented most of their heat directly outside. Henrik coughed, a deep, wet sound that had been getting worse for 3 days. His face was pale, his lips slightly blue despite sitting less than 6 feet from a roaring fire. Lars knew the signs. Henrik was losing the battle against the cold. The human body could only compensate for so long when environmental conditions were this severe. They had burned through half their winter wood supply in 6 weeks. At this rate, they would run out completely by late February. Cutting more wood in these conditions was possible, but dangerous and exhausting. Every hour spent outside in 20 below zero temperatures risked frostbite. Every swing of an axe in deep snow consumed energy they could barely afford to spend. Lars added another log to the fire and watched Henrik pull the blankets tighter. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say that would change their situation. They had built what they thought was adequate shelter, and winter was proving them catastrophically wrong. Henrik Strand died on January 16, 1867, 3 days after the coldest night. He never recovered from the deep chill that had settled into his lungs. Lars woke that morning to find his partner motionless under the blankets, his skin gray and cold. The fire had burned down to coals during the night. The cabin's interior temperature had dropped below freezing. Lars sat beside Henrik's body for an hour, not moving, not thinking clearly. They had known each other for 8 years, worked fishing boats together off the coast of Massachusetts, traveled west together seeking opportunity. Now Henrik was dead at 32 years old, killed by cold that a properly built shelter should have prevented. Burying someone in January in Montana territory was nearly impossible. The ground was frozen solid to a depth of several feet. Lars spent 2 days building a fire over the burial site, keeping it burning continuously to thaw the earth enough to dig. He managed a grave 3 feet deep on a small rise overlooking the creek where they had planned to run their trap lines. He wrapped Henrik in both blankets and lowered him into the frozen ground. There was no minister, no service, no one else present. Lars simply filled the grave, marked it with stones, and stood in the bitter cold, trying to understand what had just happened. The walk back to the cabin took 15 minutes. Lars spent those minutes looking at his shelter with new eyes. The structure that had seemed adequate in September now appeared as what it truly was, a temporary framework that provided minimal protection against serious weather. Smoke rose from the fire he had left burning, but most of that heat was escaping directly through the roof. Wind whistled through gaps in the chinking. Snow had drifted against the north wall and was actually entering the cabin through cracks between logs. Inside, Lars began a systematic examination of every failure point. He ran his hand along the gaps between logs, feeling cold air flowing through. Some gaps were wide enough to insert 2 fingers. The moss and mud chinking had not just dried and cracked, it had largely fallen out, leaving openings that might as well have been windows. The notched corners showed the worst problems. The logs had settled and shifted as the wood dried and contracted, creating gaps at the joints that were impossible to seal with simple chinking. The door was a catastrophe. Warped planks, leather hinges that had stiffened in the cold, and a frame that had never been properly constructed. Lars could see daylight around the entire perimeter. The smoke hole in the roof was necessary for ventilation, but it was also venting the majority of heat produced by their fire. Lars Peterson sat in the cold cabin and realized that Henrik had not died from bad luck or weak constitution. Henrik had died because they had built shelter that could not protect human life in Montana winter conditions. The distinction mattered because one was unavoidable tragedy and the other was a solvable problem. Lars spent the week following Henrik's burial doing calculations that would determine whether he lived or died before spring. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. He had begun winter with what he estimated was a 4-month supply of split firewood, assuming normal consumption rates. Normal, in this case, meant the amount of wood required to keep a reasonably well-insulated cabin at survivable temperatures during a Montana winter. His cabin was not reasonably well insulated. It was barely insulated at all. As a result, his wood consumption rate was approximately double what it should have been. In 6 weeks of serious cold, he had burned through half his total supply. Simple arithmetic suggested he would run completely out of firewood by mid-March. Spring weather typically did not arrive until late April or early May. 6 weeks without heat, in temperatures that routinely dropped below zero at night, meant certain death. Lars could cut more wood, but that presented its own arithmetic problem. In current conditions, cutting and splitting enough wood for 1 day of heating required roughly 4 hours of hard labor in dangerous cold. That assumed he could find dead-standing timber close enough to haul back to the cabin, that his axe stayed sharp, that he did not injure himself, and that weather permitted working outside. 4 hours of work in 20 below zero temperatures consumed enormous amounts of energy. Lars would need to eat more food to fuel that work. His food supplies were adequate, but not unlimited. Increasing consumption to support additional woodcutting would deplete his food stores faster. Running out of food created a different but equally fatal problem. There was also the compound risk factor. Every hour spent outside in extreme cold increased the chance of frostbite, injury, or simple exhaustion. A sprained ankle or frostbitten fingers could make further woodcutting impossible. One serious mistake would end him as surely as it had ended Henrik. Lars worked through these calculations, sitting beside his inadequate fire, writing figures with charcoal on a plank. The numbers kept producing the same conclusion. He could not cut wood fast enough to compensate for his cabin's heat loss. He could not survive until spring using current methods. Something fundamental had to change. The obvious solution was to improve the cabin's insulation, re-chink the gaps between logs, repair the door, reduce heat loss through the roof. Lars spent 3 days attempting exactly that. He mixed new mud and moss chinking and packed it into every gap he could reach. He stuffed cloth around the door frame. He tried to construct a baffle over the smoke hole that would retain more heat while still venting smoke. The improvements were marginal at best. The new chinking helped slightly, but it was already drying and cracking in the extreme cold. The door still leaked air around its warped planks. The smoke hole modifications reduced draft, but also made the interior smokier. After 3 days of work, Lars estimated he had reduced heat loss by perhaps 15%. It was not nearly enough. He needed a solution that addressed the fundamental problem. Standard log cabin construction in extreme cold climates was inadequate. The traditional methods everyone used, the techniques that had been passed down and repeated across the frontier, were killing people. Henrik was dead because of those methods. Lars would die too unless he found something different. The memory came to Lars on a night in late January when he was coating his boots with tallow to waterproof them against snow. The process of rubbing fat into leather triggered a connection his conscious mind had not made. He stopped mid-motion, his hands covered in tallow, and remembered something from his fishing days that he had not thought about in years. Norwegian fishing boats operating in the North Atlantic dealt with constant problems of wood rot, water penetration, and deterioration from salt exposure. Various methods existed to protect the wood. Pine tar was common. Linseed oil was used on some vessels, but Lars remembered old fishermen along the coast who swore by a different treatment. They used fish oil, rendered from the livers and fatty tissue of cod and other fish that were processed in enormous quantities. The oil was a waste product of the fishing industry. After fish were gutted and filleted, the remnants were often boiled down to extract oil that had various uses. Lars remembered watching his grandfather apply fish oil to a small fishing boat when Lars was perhaps 10 years old. The old man had heated the oil first, making it less viscous, then painted it onto the hull planks with a brush made from pig bristles. The wood had absorbed the oil, darkening several shades. His grandfather had explained that the oil filled the wood grain, sealing it against water penetration. A boat treated with fish oil would last years longer than untreated wood. The comparison to his current situation became clear. His cabin was losing heat primarily through air infiltration. Cold air entered through gaps in chinking, through the wood grain itself, as the timber breathed and contracted, through every crack and imperfection in the construction. Warm air escaped through the same roots. The result was continuous heat loss that no amount of fire could compensate for. What if he could seal the wood, not just the gaps between logs, but the wood itself, make it impermeable to air movement? Traditional chinking addressed the large gaps, but did nothing about the thousands of smaller pathways that air used to move through and around the log structure. Fish oil, if it worked on wood the way Lars remembered, might seal those pathways. The idea seemed almost absurd at first consideration. Treating an entire cabin with fish oil would require gallons of the substance. It would smell terrible. The settlement at Missoula was not a fishing port. There were no cod liver oil rendering operations. Where would he even obtain that much fish oil? But the Clark Fork River system had massive salmon runs. Every autumn, thousands of salmon migrated upstream to spawn. The local tribes harvested enormous quantities, smoking and drying fish for winter food supplies. There was a small trading post at Missoula where settlers and tribal members sometimes exchanged goods. Lars had seen smoked salmon for sale there. He had also seen barrels of what the trader called fish grease, rendered fat from salmon that was used for various purposes. Lars had never purchased fish grease, but he knew it existed and was available. The question was whether it would work as a cabin sealant and whether he could afford enough of it to treat his entire structure before he ran out of time or money or both. The trading post at Missoula consisted of a single large log building that served as general store, meeting place, and social center for the scattered settlement of perhaps 40 families spread across the valley. Lars made the trip in late January, a 4-mile walk through snow that reached past his knees in places. He arrived cold and exhausted, his beard crusted with ice from frozen breath. The trader was a French-Canadian named Baptiste Moreau, who had operated the post for 6 years. 3 other men were inside when Lars entered: William Cutter, an English settler who ran cattle on bottomland near the river; James Holloway, a former carpenter from Pennsylvania; and Thomas Brennan, an Irish homesteader who had arrived the previous spring. Lars explained what he needed: 3 barrels of fish grease, the rendered salmon oil that Moreau sold primarily to tribal customers who used it for food preservation and leather treatment. The request itself was not unusual. What raised eyebrows was Lars's explanation of intended use. Lars said. The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds before William Cutter began laughing. It was not polite amusement. It was the kind of laughter that comes from hearing something genuinely absurd. Quote 2, Cutter said. Quote 3. James Holloway shook his head. Quote 4. Thomas Brennan was less direct but equally skeptical. Quote 5. Lars tried to explain the principle. Fish oil would penetrate the wood grain, creating a barrier against air movement. It would remain flexible in extreme cold, unlike pine tar that became brittle. It would seal microgaps that chinking could not address. The explanations only generated more amusement. Moreau, to his credit, simply asked if Lars had money to pay for the barrels. Lars did, barely. The cost would consume most of his remaining cash, leaving him almost nothing for other supplies, but he was convinced the investment was necessary. Moreau helped load 3 40-pound barrels onto a sledge Lars had brought for the purpose. The other men watched, shaking their heads. Quote 6, Cutter said as Lars prepared to leave. Quote 7. The name stuck immediately. By the time Lars hauled his sledge back to his cabin, half the settlement had heard about the Norwegian who was going to paint his cabin with fish grease. The fish grease Lars purchased from Moreau was thick and partially solidified from cold storage. Before he could apply it to wood, he needed to heat it to liquid consistency and strain out impurities that had settled during rendering. The process required careful temperature control. Too hot, and the oil would smoke and lose effectiveness. Too cool, and it would not penetrate wood properly. Lars built a fire pit outside his cabin and suspended an iron pot over the flames, using a tripod made from green branches. He worked in early February during a brief warming period when temperatures climbed above freezing during midday hours. The conditions were not ideal, but they were better than attempting the work in 20 below zero cold. He poured half of 1 barrel into the pot and began heating it slowly, monitoring temperature by watching how the oil moved. When it reached the consistency of water, thin enough to pour easily, he removed it from heat and let it cool slightly. The smell was immediate and overwhelming. Rendered salmon oil carried an odor that was fishy, oily, and oddly sweet all at once. It was not quite rotten, but it was definitely organic and strong. Lars strained the heated oil through cloth to remove bits of tissue and other debris that had carried over from the rendering process. The resulting liquid was amber-colored and relatively clear. He poured it into a smaller bucket that would be easier to work with during application. The first test application went on a section of log near the door. Lars used a brush made from bundled pine needles tied to a stick. He painted the oil onto the wood surface and watched it soak in. The log darkened immediately, changing from gray weathered pine to rich honey brown. The oil penetrated deeply, disappearing into the wood grain within minutes. Lars waited 2 hours, then checked the test area. The oil had been completely absorbed. The wood surface felt different, slightly waxy but not wet. When he pressed his palm against it, the wood felt warmer than untreated sections, suggesting the oil had changed the wood's thermal properties. By the time Lars had prepared and tested his first bucket of oil, visitors had begun arriving. Word had spread that Peterson was actually going through with his fish grease plan. People came to watch and offer commentary. Children held their noses theatrically. Adults made jokes about whether Lars planned to attract every bear in Montana or just the hungry ones. Thomas Brennan's wife suggested Lars would never get the smell out of his clothes. William Cutter, passing by on horseback, simply shouted, quote, "8," and rode on laughing. Lars ignored them and continued working. Lars began the full application on February 8th, starting with the cabin's south wall where sun exposure would help the oil cure. He worked methodically, heating oil in batches, straining it, and applying it with his pine needle brush in overlapping strokes that ensured complete coverage. The process was slow and physically demanding. His arms ached from the repetitive motion. The smell clung to his hands, his clothes, his hair. The logs absorbed oil at different rates depending on their density and how weathered they were. Some sections required 2 applications to achieve the saturation Lars wanted. Others soaked up oil so quickly that he could watch it disappear into the wood grain. He learned to recognize when a log had absorbed enough by the way the surface changed from matte to slightly glossy. The first complete wall took 3 days. Lars worked from dawn until the light failed, pausing only to eat and reheat oil batches. The temperature stayed marginally above freezing during daylight hours, which helped the oil remain workable. At night, everything froze solid, including the oil in his buckets. Each morning required reheating before work could continue. The smell intensified as more surface area was treated. The odor hung in the still February air, noticeable from hundreds of yards away. Lars's cabin became a landmark defined by scent. People could navigate to it with their eyes closed. Children made a game of seeing how close they could get before the smell drove them back. Adults walked wide circles around the property, holding handkerchiefs to their faces. James Holloway, who lived closest to Lars, complained that he could smell fish oil inside his own cabin when the wind blew from the wrong direction. Lars finished the south and east walls by February 15th. He moved to the north wall, which required scaffolding constructed from poles lashed together with rope. Working above ground level while handling heated oil required concentration. One slip could result in serious burns or a dangerous fall. The west wall, which included the door, presented additional challenges. Lars had to work around the entrance, carefully treating the door frame and the warped planks of the door itself. He applied extra coats to the door, reasoning that it was the largest single opening and therefore the most critical area to seal properly. By February 20th, the entire exterior was treated. Lars had used all 3 barrels of fish grease and had covered approximately 400 square feet of log surface with multiple coats of oil. The cabin's appearance had transformed completely. The weathered gray logs were now uniform honey brown, and the whole structure seemed to glow slightly in sunlight. The smell did not fade quickly. Lars had hoped that after application the fish oil would cure and lose its potency within a few days. Instead, the odor persisted for weeks, filling the valley around his cabin with an aroma that was impossible to ignore or escape. Every settler within half a mile could smell it constantly, Those farther away caught whiffs when wind conditions were right. The settlement's reaction evolved from initial mockery to genuine irritation. Thomas Brennan rode to Lars's cabin on February 23rd to voice his family's complaints. His wife could not hang laundry outside because everything absorbed the fish smell. His children refused to play outdoors. The odor was seeping into their food stores, making everything taste faintly of salmon. Lars apologized but offered no solutions. The oil needed time to cure. There was nothing he could do to accelerate the process. Brennan rode away shaking his head, muttering about crazy Norwegians and their insane ideas. William Cutter's complaints were more public. He made a point of discussing Peterson's fish house at the trading post, describing in elaborate detail how the smell had ruined his family's February. He claimed his horses refused to graze downwind of Lars's cabin. He suggested that come spring, Lars would discover bears camped on his doorstep, drawn by the scent of what they would assume was a massive salmon cache. James Holloway, meanwhile, had begun building his own cabin on a plot about 300 yards from Lars's location. Holloway was a skilled carpenter who worked with precision and speed. He laid out his foundation on February 16th, the same day Lars finished his oil application. By February 20th, Holloway had his walls up and his roof in place. The entire construction had taken 4 days. Holloway made sure everyone knew the comparison: 4 days of efficient work using proven methods versus 3 weeks of backbreaking labor that produced a cabin that smelled like a fish processing plant. He invited neighbors to inspect his construction, pointing out his tight notching, his properly fitted door, his carefully chinked gaps. This, he explained, was how you built a proper frontier cabin. Lars watched Holloway's progress from a distance and said nothing. Holloway's cabin was indeed well built by conventional standards. The notching was precise. The door fit its frame properly. The chinking looked solid. By all traditional measures, Holloway had constructed a quality structure in a fraction of the time Lars had spent. But Lars noticed details that Holloway either missed or considered unimportant. The gaps between logs, no matter how well chinked, were still gaps. Air would find pathways through that chinking, especially as it dried and contracted during continued cold. The notched corners, while precisely cut, still created the structural weaknesses Lars had identified in his own original construction. The door, though better fitted than Lars's warped planks, was still just wood held together with iron nails and mounted on surface hinges. Lars kept these observations to himself. The settlement had already decided he was either foolish or insane. Criticizing Holloway's conventional methods would only reinforce that assessment. Instead, Lars focused on his own cabin and waited for the oil to cure. March arrived with temperatures that fluctuated wildly. Days would warm to 40 degrees, melting snow and creating mud everywhere. Nights would drop back below freezing, turning the mud to ice and coating everything with frost. The weather pattern was typical for late winter in Montana, the slow, chaotic transition between deep cold and eventual spring. The temperature swings affected the fish oil's curing process. During warm days, the oil became slightly soft again, oozing slowly from the wood grain. During freezing nights, it hardened and seemed to contract into the wood more deeply. Lars observed these cycles carefully, trying to understand what was happening chemically. He had no scientific training, but he could see that the freeze-thaw pattern was affecting how the oil bonded with the wood. By mid-March, the smell had diminished noticeably. It was still present, especially on warm days when the oil softened, but it no longer dominated the entire valley. Thomas Brennan's family stopped complaining. William Cutter found other topics to discuss at the trading post. The settlement's attention moved on to other matters. Lars used this period to observe his cabin's performance. He had continued burning fires throughout February and into March, carefully tracking his wood consumption. The numbers were striking. Where he had been burning through his wood pile at an alarming rate in January, His consumption had dropped dramatically after the oil treatment. He was now using approximately half the wood he had burned before application. The difference was most noticeable on cold nights. His cabin retained heat in ways it never had previously. The interior temperature stayed stable for hours after the fire burned down to coals. In the morning, the cabin was cold but not frozen. Before oil treatment, Lars would wake to find water frozen solid in his bucket. Now, the water was cold but still liquid. He also noticed that wind no longer affected interior temperature as dramatically. January storms had created immediate temperature drops inside the cabin as wind drove cold air through every gap and crack. March storms produced no such effect. The wind howled outside, but the cabin's interior remained relatively stable. The logs themselves had changed visibly. The oil saturation had darkened them to a rich honey brown that varied in shade depending on how much oil each section had absorbed. The south wall, which received the most sun exposure, had developed an almost golden tone. The north wall was deeper brown, nearly amber. The variation created a pattern that was oddly attractive, though Lars had not applied the oil with aesthetics in mind. The texture of the wood had changed too. Running his hand across the logs, Lars felt a surface that was smooth and slightly waxy. The oil had filled the grain, creating a finish that was fundamentally different from raw wood. Water beaded on the surface rather than soaking in. Snow that landed on the walls slid off as it melted, rather than penetrating into cracks. By late March, Lars was confident the treatment had worked. His cabin was performing dramatically better than it had before oil application. The question was whether anyone else would notice or care. Lars survived his first winter in Montana. By April, temperatures had moderated enough that heating the cabin no longer required constant attention. His woodpile, which calculations had suggested would be exhausted by mid-March, lasted into May. He had burned less than 2/3 of his total supply despite one of the coldest winters on record. The fish oil treatment had reduced his fuel consumption by approximately 40%. Spring brought the seasonal work of frontier life. Lars planted a small garden, repaired equipment, prepared for the trapping season that would begin in autumn. The settlement around Missoula grew slowly as new families arrived. Drawn by land availability and resource opportunity, several newcomers built cabins using standard methods. Lars watched them repeat the same construction patterns he had used initially. Summer passed quietly. Lars kept largely to himself, working his trap lines along the creek tributaries, smoking fish for winter supplies, cutting and splitting firewood for the coming cold season. Other settlers occasionally asked about his fish oil treatment, but the questions were casual and skeptical. No one took the idea seriously enough to attempt it themselves. Autumn brought the salmon runs Lars had anticipated. Thousands of fish fought their way upstream to spawn in the same creeks Lars trapped. He harvested what he needed for food and watched the rest complete their life cycle. The abundance was remarkable. The local tribes took enormous quantities, processing fish in ways that wasted almost nothing. Lars traded for additional barrels of fish grease from tribal members who rendered it as a byproduct of their preservation work. By October, Lars had 6 barrels stored for potential future use. He did not know if he would need them. The fish oil treatment from the previous winter appeared to be holding. The logs still showed their honey-brown coloration. Water still beaded on their surface. The cabin's structural integrity seemed unchanged. November 1868 brought the first serious cold snap. Temperature dropped to 15 below zero over a 3-day period. Snow fell heavily, accumulating to depths of 2 feet in exposed areas. Wind swept down from the mountains with force that rattled poorly secured structures. Lars monitored his cabin's performance carefully. He burned fires of moderate size, nothing like the roaring blazes he had maintained the previous winter. The interior temperature stayed comfortable, hovering around 50 degrees, even when outside temperatures were far below zero. His wood consumption was minimal compared to the previous year. He was burning perhaps one-third the fuel he had required before treatment. More importantly, he was comfortable. The constant battle against cold that had defined his first winter was absent. He could sleep without piling on every blanket he owned. He could wake in the morning without dreading the brutal cold of an inadequately heated cabin. The fish oil treatment had transformed his living conditions completely. The settlement's other cabins were not faring as well. Smoke poured from chimneys as families burned enormous quantities of wood, trying to maintain livable temperatures. The storm arrived on December 9, 1868, moving down from Canada, with a fury that surprised even experienced frontiersmen who thought they understood Montana weather. The temperature dropped from 20 degrees to 30 below zero in less than 6 hours. Wind began blowing sustained speeds that knocked down weakened trees and tore poorly secured roof sections from cabins. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The blizzard lasted 3 days. During that time, venturing outside for more than a few minutes risked frostbite or disorientation. The wind created drifts that buried structures to their roof lines. Livestock that could not reach shelter froze to death in the fields. The settlement of Missoula essentially stopped functioning, with each family isolated in whatever shelter they occupied when the storm began. Lars spent those 3 days inside his cabin, burning moderate fires and monitoring conditions. He had adequate firewood stacked inside, enough to last a week without needing to venture out. His food supplies were sufficient. He had water from melted snow. The situation was uncomfortable, but not dangerous. The cabin's performance during the blizzard was remarkable. Despite wind that shook the structure and temperatures that dropped lower than Lars had ever experienced, the interior remained stable. The fish oil-sealed walls prevented the wind-driven cold from penetrating. Heat from his fire stayed inside rather than escaping through countless small gaps. The temperature inside never dropped below 40 degrees, even when the outside air was 30 below zero. Lars could hear the wind screaming around his cabin, but he could not feel it inside. That distinction was critical. Wind chill was what killed people in these conditions. Exposure to moving air at extreme temperatures would freeze exposed skin in minutes and drain body heat with terrifying efficiency. Inside his sealed cabin, the air was still, cold but still. That made all the difference. On the second night of the blizzard, Lars lay in his sleeping area listening to the storm and thought about Henrik. His partner had died in temperatures that were warm compared to what was happening outside right now. Henrik had died because their cabin could not retain heat, because the structure they built using standard methods was inadequate for serious Montana winter conditions. Lars was surviving the worst storm he had ever experienced because he had sealed his cabin with fish oil. The connection was direct and undeniable. The innovation that the settlement had mocked, that had earned his cabin the nickname Fish House, that William Cutter still joked about at the trading post, was keeping him alive. The storm broke on the morning of December 12th. Lars woke to silence. The wind had stopped. Snow was no longer falling. He opened his door to find drifts that reached past his waist, and a landscape transformed into endless white under a clear pale blue sky. The temperature was still brutally cold, but the storm itself had passed. Lars checked his woodpile. He had burned perhaps 1/4 of his indoor supply during the 3-day storm. At this rate, his total winter wood supply would last easily into April. The settlement emerged slowly from the blizzard. Families dug out from drifts, checked on livestock, assessed damage to structures. The storm had been severe enough that Baptiste Moreau rang the bell at the trading post, a signal used only for emergencies that required community response. People began gathering to share information about conditions and coordinate help for anyone in serious trouble. Lars made the trip to the trading post on snowshoes, breaking trail through drifts that would have been impassable otherwise. The 4-mile journey took 3 hours. When he arrived, roughly 20 people had already gathered. The conversations were grim. Thomas Brennan's family had burned through 2 weeks' worth of firewood in 3 days, trying to keep their cabin warm enough to survive. They had depleted their supply to dangerously low levels and would need help cutting more immediately. James Holloway's well-built cabin had performed better than most, but even he had consumed firewood at rates that worried him. His family had stayed warm, but the cost in fuel had been enormous. He was recalculating his winter wood needs, realizing he had underestimated by a significant margin. William Cutter had lost 6 head of cattle that had been sheltering in a draw when the storm hit. The animals had frozen to death before they could reach better protection. Cutter was angry and looking for someone to blame, though the weather was obviously not anyone's fault. Baptiste Moreau reported that 2 families living on the settlement's eastern edge had not been heard from since before the storm. A group was organizing to check on them as soon as conditions permitted safe travel. The concern was real. 3 days isolated in inadequate shelter during that storm could easily have resulted in deaths. The conversation eventually turned to Lars. Someone asked how he had fared during the blizzard. Lars explained that his cabin had performed well, that he had stayed warm without burning excessive firewood. The response was initially dismissive. Everyone had their own storm stories, and most were not interested in hearing about Peterson's experience. But Thomas Brennan asked a direct question. How much firewood had Lars actually burned during the 3-day storm? Lars gave an honest answer. Roughly 1/4 of what he had stored inside his cabin for exactly this kind of emergency, perhaps 10 to 15 pieces of split wood per day. The number created sudden silence. Brennan had burned more than that per hour trying to keep his family from freezing. Holloway had gone through nearly 50 pieces per day. The difference was so dramatic that several people assumed Lars was exaggerating or misremembering. William Cutter suggested Lars had simply gotten lucky with his cabin's location, that perhaps the surrounding terrain had provided wind protection. But others knew the geography. Lars's cabin sat on exposed ground, with no particular shelter from wind. If anything, his location should have made conditions worse, not better. James Holloway asked the question that was becoming obvious. How had Lars's cabin retained heat so much more efficiently than everyone else's structures? What was different about his construction? Lars hesitated, knowing the answer would invite mockery, but decided to be direct. Fish oil, he said. The treatment he had applied the previous winter had sealed his cabin against air infiltration. The mockery Lars expected did not materialize. The blizzard had been too severe, the fuel consumption differences too dramatic for casual dismissal. William Cutter started to make a joke about fish houses, but Thomas Brennan cut him off with a sharp look. People were cold, exhausted, worried about surviving the rest of winter. Nobody had energy for jokes that no longer seemed funny. James Holloway asked technical questions. How had Lars applied the fish oil? How much had he used? How long had the application taken? What had the oil actually done to the wood? The questions were detailed and serious, coming from someone who understood construction and wanted specific information. Lars answered honestly. He described heating the oil, straining it, painting it onto the logs with a brush. He explained how the oil had penetrated the wood grain, sealing it against air movement. He talked about the smell, the curing time, the changes in wood appearance and texture. He estimated he had used roughly 120 pounds of fish grease to treat his entire cabin exterior. The cost came up immediately. 3 barrels of fish grease at the prices Moreau charged would consume most of a family's cash reserves. It was a significant investment for something that might not work. Holloway pointed out that his cabin had cost almost nothing beyond labor because he had used standard methods and materials available freely. Lars acknowledged the cost but noted that he had already saved more in firewood than the fish grease had cost. His fuel consumption had dropped by more than half. Over a full winter, that represented enormous savings in labor, time, and the physical risk of cutting wood in dangerous conditions. The investment had paid for itself in one season and would continue paying dividends for years. Thomas Brennan asked if fish oil treatment could be applied to an existing cabin. His structure was already built using conventional methods. Could he treat it now, or did the oil only work on new construction? Lars explained that he had treated his cabin after it was built. After a full winter of use had revealed its inadequacies, there was no reason the same treatment could not work on any log structure. The conversation continued for another hour. Other settlers asked questions. Some were skeptical, suggesting that Lars had simply built a better cabin by chance and the fish oil was coincidental. Others wanted to know if the oil attracted animals, whether it degraded over time, whether it would need reapplication every year. Lars did not have answers to all the questions. He had been working from theory and observation, not scientific certainty. But he could report what he knew. The oil had been on his cabin for nearly 2 years. It showed no signs of degrading. The color had remained stable, water still beaded on the surface. Most importantly, the cabin's insulation properties had not diminished. If anything, they seemed to have improved slightly as the oil cured more completely. Baptiste Moreau, who had been listening quietly, mentioned that he had 8 barrels of fish grease in storage. Tribal suppliers brought it regularly because it had various uses. If settlers wanted to experiment with cabin treatment, the material was available. Moreau would not raise his prices despite increased demand. He charged what the grease cost him, plus a modest markup. Samuel Chen arrived at Lars's cabin on a cold January morning in 1869. Chen was a Chinese immigrant who had worked on railroad construction crews before coming to Montana Territory seeking land and independence from the brutal conditions of rail work. He was building a cabin 2 miles south of the main settlement and had heard about Peterson's fish oil treatment from conversations at the trading post. Chen spoke limited English, but he communicated clearly enough. He wanted to see Lars's cabin up close, to examine the logs, to understand how the treatment worked. Lars welcomed him and spent an hour showing Chen every detail. They walked around the exterior while Lars explained the application process, pointing out how the oil had darkened the wood and created a sealed surface. Chen ran his hands over the logs, feeling the waxy texture. He knocked on the wood, listening to how it sounded compared to untreated timber. He examined the corners and the door, noting how thoroughly Lars had covered every surface. He asked questions through a combination of broken English and hand gestures. Lars answered as clearly as he could, demonstrating with a small piece of wood how the oil soaked into the grain. After the examination, Chen asked if he could purchase one of Lars's extra barrels of fish grease. Lars had 6 barrels stored from his autumn trading. He sold one to Chen at the same price Moreau charged, not seeking profit, but willing to help someone who was taking the idea seriously. Chen returned to his construction site and spent the next 3 weeks applying fish oil to his partially completed cabin. Unlike Lars, who had treated his cabin after a winter of use revealed its flaws, Chen was treating his structure during initial construction. The timing allowed him to seal the logs before they were fully assembled, coating surfaces that would be difficult to reach once the walls were raised. Word spread that the Chinese settler was copying Peterson's method. Some people were curious, others remained skeptical. William Cutter made predictable comments about the settlement now having 2 fish houses that would stink up the valley come spring. But the mockery was less intense than it had been toward Lars. Chen was simply following someone else's proven approach rather than attempting something entirely untested. By late February, Chen's cabin was complete and fully treated. The structure was smaller than Lars's, but it showed the same honey-brown coloration and sealed surface. Chen burned a test fire and monitored his cabin's heat retention. The results matched what Lars had experienced. The interior stayed warm with minimal fuel consumption. Cold air did not penetrate through gaps. The cabin functioned as an effective, insulated shelter. Thomas Brennan visited Chen's cabin in early March and came away convinced. Two separate structures, built by different men, using the same treatment method, both performing dramatically better than conventional construction. The pattern was too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. By late February 1869, 4 additional settlers had purchased fish grease from Baptiste Moreau and begun treating their cabins. The applications varied in thoroughness. Some people treated only their north-facing walls, reasoning that wind from that direction caused the most heat loss. Others did partial treatments, covering the lower portions of their cabins where they suspected gaps were worst. Only one settler, besides Chen, attempted complete exterior coverage matching what Lars had done. The partial treatments produced partial results. Cabins with only north walls treated showed some improvement in heat retention, but they still lost significant warmth through untreated surfaces. The settler who did complete coverage reported performance similar to Lars and Chen. His firewood consumption dropped by nearly half. His family stayed comfortable in conditions that had been miserable the previous winter. Thomas Brennan waited until March before committing to treatment. He watched the early adopters, monitored their results, and asked detailed questions about process and outcome. When he finally purchased fish grease, he bought enough to do the job thoroughly. He heated the oil carefully, applied it in multiple coats, and covered every inch of his cabin's exterior, including the roof edges where heat loss had been particularly bad. Brennan's cabin transformation took 2 weeks. The smell was as bad as everyone remembered from Lars's treatment 2 years earlier, but Brennan endured the complaints from his family and neighbors. By the time he finished, his cabin looked similar to Lars's, honey-brown logs with a sealed, slightly glossy surface that repelled water and blocked air movement. The results convinced the remaining skeptics. Brennan was a practical man with 15 years of construction experience. He was not prone to foolish experiments or wasted effort. If Brennan judged fish oil treatment worthwhile after careful observation and analysis, the technique had genuine merit. April brought mild weather that made cabin heating less critical, but it also brought reflection on the winter just past. Families that had treated their cabins with fish oil had burned significantly less firewood, suffered less from cold, and spent less time in the dangerous work of cutting fuel in brutal conditions. Families that had not treated their cabins had struggled through another hard winter, consuming wood at rates that strained their supplies and their physical capacity to replenish them. By May, Baptiste Moreau had sold 23 barrels of fish grease for cabin treatment purposes. The trading post, which had previously stocked fish grease primarily for tribal customers who used it in food preparation and leather work, now maintained larger inventory, specifically for settler construction use. Moreau began ordering additional barrels from his suppliers, anticipating continued demand. The technique was spreading organically, shared through observation and conversation rather than formal instruction. Settlers who had treated their cabins answered questions from neighbors. New arrivals heard about fish oil treatment during their first visits to the trading post. The method was becoming standard practice rather than experimental innovation. Jacob Morrison was a traveling merchant who operated a circuit through Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming territories, bringing goods to isolated settlements that were too small or remote to support permanent stores. He arrived in Missoula in June 1869 with 2 wagons of supplies and immediate questions about the fish oil-treated cabins that several people in other settlements had mentioned. Morrison was a businessman who understood markets and opportunity. He recognized that fish oil cabin treatment represented a product need that was not being met efficiently. Fish grease was available in some locations, but not others. Settlers who wanted to try the technique often could not obtain adequate supplies. Morrison saw potential profit in becoming a specialized supplier. He spent 3 days in Missoula examining treated cabins, talking to Lars and others who had applied the technique, and calculating costs and logistics. The economics were favorable. Fish grease could be purchased in bulk from tribal suppliers along major salmon rivers. It could be transported in sealed barrels that were standard freight. It could be sold at reasonable markup to settlers in locations where local supply did not exist. Morrison approached Lars with a proposal. Would Lars be willing to explain his technique to settlers in other locations if Morrison brought him along on parts of his circuit? Lars would receive payment for his time and expertise. Morrison would handle travel arrangements and cover expenses. The partnership would help spread the innovation while generating income for both men. Lars agreed. The arrangement appealed to him for reasons beyond money. Henrik had died because of inadequate shelter. If Lars could help prevent similar deaths by teaching others how to build better insulated cabins, that seemed worthwhile work. Over the next 18 months, Lars made 3 trips with Morrison, visiting settlements scattered across hundreds of miles of territory. In each location, he demonstrated fish oil application technique, answered questions about process and materials, and helped settlers understand why the treatment worked. Morrison sold fish grease from inventory he had accumulated specifically for this purpose. The reception varied by location. Some settlements embraced the technique immediately, particularly those in high elevation areas where winter cold was most severe. Other communities were skeptical, preferring traditional methods they understood, but in every location, at least a few people tried the treatment. Those early adopters became local advocates who spread the practice within their own communities. By 1871, fish oil-treated cabins existed throughout the northern Rocky Mountain region. The technique had spread far beyond Missoula, carried by traveling merchants, settlers who relocated, and simple word of mouth among frontier communities that shared information about survival methods that worked. The transformation happened gradually, without proclamations or formal adoption, simply through the accumulated decisions of individual settlers choosing methods that worked better than alternatives. By 1873, fish oil cabin treatment had become common enough in Montana and Idaho territories that newcomers arriving from the east encountered it as established practice rather than experimental innovation. Trading posts throughout the region stocked fish grease specifically for construction purposes. Tribal suppliers who rendered oil from salmon runs found steady markets among settler communities. The technique that had begun with Lars Peterson's desperate attempt to survive winter had become standard frontier knowledge. The practical advantages extended beyond the heat retention that had driven initial adoption. Settlers discovered that fish oil treatment significantly extended cabin longevity. Logs sealed against moisture penetration did not rot as quickly as untreated wood. The oil prevented insect damage by filling the wood grain where beetles and other pests would normally bore. Cabins that might have required major repairs after 5 years remained structurally sound for decades when properly treated. The economic impact was substantial. Families living in fish oil treated cabins burned approximately 40 to 50% less firewood than those in conventional structures. Over a winter lasting 5 to 6 months, that reduction represented hundreds of hours of labor saved, thousands of pounds of wood that did not need to be cut and hauled, and significantly reduced risk from the dangerous work of logging in extreme cold. The technique also saved lives in ways that were difficult to quantify precisely because survival often went unrecorded. But accounts from the period include multiple references to families weathering severe storms in treated cabins that would likely have proven fatal in conventional structures. The blizzard of 1872, which killed an estimated 40 people across Montana territory, resulted in far fewer deaths in communities where fish oil treatment was common practice. The method evolved as more people experimented with variations. Some settlers added pine resin to the fish oil, creating a mixture that was harder and more weather-resistant. Others discovered that heating logs before application helped the oil penetrate more deeply. A few people tried applying multiple thin coats rather than fewer thick applications and reported better results. The core principle remained consistent: seal the wood against air and moisture penetration, but the specific techniques diversified based on available materials and individual preferences. By 1875, the phrase, quote, "Nindas," had entered frontier vocabulary as a compliment indicating superior construction. Few people using the phrase knew who Peterson actually was or remembered that the technique had originated with a Norwegian fisherman trying to survive his second Montana winter. The innovation had separated from its inventor and become communal knowledge, part of the collective wisdom that frontier communities developed and shared for mutual survival. Lars himself rarely discussed his role in developing the technique. When asked, he simply explained what he had done and why. He never claimed special credit or suggested that others owed him recognition. Lars Peterson married Marie Duchamp in 1874. She was the daughter of a French-Canadian trapper who had died the previous winter. Leaving her alone in a settlement where single women faced limited options, Lars was 41 years old, weathered by a decade of frontier life, still living in the cabin he had treated with fish oil 7 years earlier. The marriage was practical rather than romantic initially, but it developed into genuine partnership. They had 3 children over the next 6 years. The cabin that had housed one man alone now sheltered a family. Lars expanded the structure in 1876, adding a second room and treating the new logs with fish oil before assembly. The addition matched the original construction in appearance and performance. Visitors could not distinguish where the original cabin ended and the expansion began. Marie adapted to the faint smell that never entirely left the cabin's interior. On warm summer days, the oil scent would strengthen slightly as heat drew it from the wood. The smell was not unpleasant exactly, just distinctive. Their children grew up not noticing it, and visitors stopped remarking on it after the first few minutes. Lars continued trapping until 1882, when age and accumulated injuries made the work too difficult. He transitioned to ranching on a small scale, running cattle on bottomland. He had gradually acquired through homestead claims and purchases from settlers who left the territory. The ranch was never large or particularly profitable, but it provided stable income that supported his family comfortably. The settlement around Missoula grew into a town with a population approaching 2,000 by 1885. The frontier was becoming civilization. Telegraph lines connected Montana to the rest of the nation. The railroad arrived, bringing goods and people that transformed the region's economy. The era of isolated cabins and subsistence living was ending, replaced by commercial agriculture, mining operations, and permanent towns with brick buildings and established institutions. But the cabins remained. Scattered across the valleys and mountainsides, dozens of structures built using fish oil treatment stood as testament to what practical innovation could accomplish. Some were still occupied by the families who had built them. Others had been abandoned as people moved to town or left the territory entirely. All of them showed the same characteristics: honey-brown logs that had weathered decades without rot, structural integrity that exceeded conventional construction, and evidence of thoughtful engineering applied to fundamental survival problems. Lars Peterson died in March 1896 at age 63. The cause was pneumonia following a winter cold he could not shake. He was buried in the Missoula cemetery next to Marie, who had died 2 years earlier. His children inherited the ranch and the cabin that had started everything. The cabin stood for another 40 years before being dismantled in 1936 to make room for modern construction. By then it had housed 3 generations of the Peterson family and had survived 59 Montana winters without major structural failure. The logs, when finally pulled apart, were still solid, still showing the honey-brown coloration of fish oil treatment applied 7 decades earlier.